Good Sunday afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another Southern Oregon Weather Weekend Update. I want to start by discussing fire weather concerns, because we have some extreme fire danger again to start the week. We'll talk about our forecast for the rest of the week, and then conclude with a longer-term outlook for the fall and winter. So first, let's talk about the fire weather risk. The National Weather Service has issued a red flag warning for the beginning of the week, Monday, mainly into Monday night. And what this means is that there's going to be a combination of gusty east winds, low relative humidity, and high temperatures, much like we saw 3 weeks ago. Is this going to be an exact repeat scenario? It isn't looking like it. Winds aren't forecast to be nearly as high, largely 10 to 20 miles per hour with gusts up to 30 miles an hour. However, this setup is very similar in many ways to the setup that we saw 3 weeks ago, and it's really going to lead to poor firefighting conditions over active fires, and it's also going to contribute to the spread of any new fires that begin early this week. Is this a guarantee that new fires are going to erupt? No, there has to be a source. However, if there is a source, this could lead to very rapid growth of new fires. So this is something to keep in mind. I'm frankly a little bit concerned about this. I'm sure many others are as well. And I would encourage you to monitor local news sources, the National Weather Service page in Medford. Just stay up to date on the latest information in case our fire situation changes very rapidly here in the valley. Much like it did 3 weeks ago, these situations can change very fast in these kind of conditions where there are gusty winds, and these conditions can cause fires to move very fast and to grow very fast. So be very cautious, not only in making plans for tomorrow. I frankly would probably not travel into the mountains tomorrow, but also be cautious in how you're using power tools, where you're parking. Parking off the road in tall grass can be a fire risk. So keep those things in mind and really try to be conservative with your planning and decision making tomorrow. Here is the relative humidity map for tomorrow afternoon. And you can see, again, we're getting into the single digits, which is not good news as far as fire weather is concerned. Here's the wind map, 10-meter wind gusts. You can see many areas of the valley are expected to see 15 to 20 mile per hour gusts, maybe up to 25, 30 miles per hour in some areas. This again can lead to very rapid fire growth if we see any new fires start. Once again, there has to be a spark, there has to be a source. But once new fires get going, they have the potential to spread very rapidly in these types of conditions. So what's causing this? Again, very similar setup to what we saw 3 weeks ago, with a strong pressure gradient over the Cascades, cooler air, higher heights, higher surface pressure across the east side, and warmer air leading to lower pressure along the west side valleys. And this is going to lead to southeasterly flow across the Cascades. Again, very similar situation to what we saw 3 weeks ago. The bigger picture forces us to look all the way across the Pacific to Japan and the West Pacific. I explained a couple weeks ago that one of the reasons we saw such a strong ridge of high pressure in our previous easterly flow scenario was because of typhoon activity in the West Pacific, and we're seeing that again. This is Typhoon Kajira, and this type of typhoon activity helps set up a 500 millibar pattern that gives us very warm weather over the west coast and can lead to these easterly wind events at this time of year. So here's a 500 millibar map of the Pacific Northern Hemisphere. Here you can see these lower heights over Japan. Here you can see Typhoon Kajira developing. And what the typhoon is going to do is amplify this Siberian ridge which in turn is going to amplify this Aleutian low, which in turn is going to amplify the ridge over the west coast. And you can see this trough, these blue colors, moving into the central part of the U.S. and the Rockies. Again, very similar to what we saw 3 weeks ago. This is the system that brought us some rain a couple days ago, and ironically, this is now going to lead to our fire weather concerns by giving us this easterly wind event. Because this cool air is going to lead to higher heights at the surface inland, and the warmth under this ridge is going to lead to lower pressure along the west side valleys, and so it's going to promote flow from east to west at the surface. So it's interesting to note how it's all part of a larger pattern, and it's a pattern that is not very favorable for areas along the west coast that are contending with active fires. So another reason why we're going to see this pattern set up is because of the Madden-Julian Oscillation. So we not only have tropical forcing in the West Pacific, we also have tropical forcing in the Indian Ocean that is contributing to our current pattern. And you can see we're currently in MJO Phase 5, and we're supposed to sit there really for the next 2 weeks. And the correlation for Phase 5 is a warm one, a warm west part of the U.S. and a cooler east. And this pattern really, unfortunately, isn't going to go anywhere for a couple weeks. It's going to take us into the middle of October. It's certainly going to give us a warm week as a whole. Of course, we're going to start the week very warm, and then there's just a very slight cooling trend as we head later into the week. But here's the pattern a week later, according to the GEFS ensemble. That ridge hasn't gone anywhere. That Aleutian low is still there. The Siberian high here is still very strong, and the trough is in the east. Look at day 10. Still very similar. We have an Aleutian low, ridge over the west coast, trough in the east. Finally, by day 14 or so, which puts us close to the middle of October, we see the ridge shifting just ever so slightly to the east. And maybe the Aleutian low tries to extend toward the west coast a little bit, but this is going to be a very stubborn pattern that's going to take a while to break down, both because of our tropical forcing in the Indian Ocean, so the MJO staying in Phase 5, and because of these typhoons in the West Pacific that are just going to amplify this 500 millibar pattern and keep us stuck under this ridge for a long time. So I wanted to end with some thoughts about the longer-term seasonal outlook. So here's our current sea surface temperature anomaly map. You can see these colder than normal areas along the Pacific. We're seeing a gradual shift toward maybe more of a basin-wide La Nina as opposed to just an east-based one. We're seeing some of these cooler waters shift to the west just a little bit. However, the coldest waters are still in these ENSO 1+2 regions. We're also seeing a little bit of a negative IOD, Indian Ocean dipole, with cooler water along the coast of Africa here and warmer water near Indonesia and Australia. That's also important to observe. And then we're noticing how we're seeing some cooling here in the Gulf of Alaska. There's still some very warm water along the west coast, but in general, we're seeing the warmest water develop north of Hawaii, and we're seeing some cooling in the Gulf of Alaska, and that's a good sign if you like a cooler and snowier winter. What I did is I looked through several years from the past 2 decades that were similar in terms of the sea surface temperature pattern to this year. And we've talked about this before. These are called analogs. And you can see a couple of those years lined up with this current year in a number of ways. Some of them also had a negative IOD, in particular 2016, 2008, 2010. Many of them did have the warmest water north of Hawaii versus along the west coast. Many of them were east-based La Ninas. Many of them had a positive QBO. Don't have time to explain that now, but we'll probably get into that in another update. Interestingly, only a few of them had hot Septembers. So basically, I took the years that had the most similarities to this current year, and I blended them together. And what we see is that the November to January pattern is somewhat drier. This ridge is sitting over the warmest water, which is north of Hawaii, just like this current year, but it wants to extend toward the west coast a little bit. And we have to wait until February, March, and April to really see a substantially cooler and wetter than normal pattern. One of the years that particularly stands out to me is September 2011, because this was one of the only years that featured a very warm September, like we're experiencing currently. And look at how similar September 2011 was to our current September. You can see a suggestion of some tropical activity south of Japan, which in turn pumps the ridge in this area, deepens the Aleutian Low, and puts a ridge over the western U.S. Very similar to our current situation. Look what happened in October. The ridge is still over the southwest, but the Aleutian Low has pushed toward the west coast a little bit. So this gives us hope that there could be a gradual pattern change heading into the middle of October, just like the GEFS ensemble was starting to suggest. We're seeing this on the CFS weeklies as well. Into the middle of October, this ridge is forecast to shift into the central part of the U.S., and that means we could come under the influence of this Aleutian Low. Not a guarantee, but we're kind of grasping at straws here, looking for this very resilient hot and dry pattern to break. This is a glimmer of hope, so we'll take it for now. So guys, let's wrap up. We do have very extreme fire danger to start the week because of another easterly wind event, so do be extremely careful. Be careful with your planning, with your decision making to start the week, and monitor local news sources and the National Weather Service forecasts to stay updated, because these fire conditions can change very rapidly in this type of situation where we have strong winds and very hot temperatures. We are expecting temperatures to gradually cool through the week, but they'll remain quite a bit above average. It'll really feel more like the end of August than the end of September. And that's thanks to the stubborn ridge of high pressure, which is just supposed to stay parked over the west coast, really through week 2. Thanks to those typhoons in the western Pacific and the MJO just sitting in phase 5 for a while. Longer term, we're hoping that we could see a gradual pattern shift that could start in mid-October. That's what happened in 2011, which is very similar to this year. It's a pretty strong analog for this year. And some of the mid-range models, like the CFS weeklies, are starting to see that as well. As far as the winter as a whole is concerned, it looks like overall we could see a drier early part of the winter, so December and January, and then a wetter later part of the winter into spring, so a wetter February, March, and April. Guys, I wish I could provide some better news, but this is the weather that we're given for this week. So, as one forecaster says, enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got, and I'll see you for the next weekend update.